The moment I returned from vacation, I found my 200-year-old ranch tree gone. HOA called it ugly, but they had no idea they just destroyed a priceless piece of history worth $1 million. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this: where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The first thing I noticed when I came home wasn't what I saw. It was what was missing. The ranch was too quiet. That was the first thought that crossed my mind as my truck rolled through the old wooden gate and onto the gravel road leading to my home. For 20 years, I knew every sound this place made. The wind moving through the tall grass, the creek running behind the eastern field, the birds that always gathered in the branches of the massive oak tree standing near the center of my property. But that afternoon, something felt wrong. The silence was heavier than normal. I parked my truck and stepped outside, expecting to see the same view I had left before my vacation. The same open land, the same weathered barn, the same old tree that had watched over my family for generations. But instead, I saw an empty space. At first, my mind refused to accept it. I stood there staring at the patch of land where the tree had stood for more than 200 years. Then I noticed the fresh tire tracks, the scattered wood chips, the massive stump left behind. My name is Nathan Holloway, and that tree wasn't just part of my ranch. It was part of my life. My grandfather planted nothing there. He always told me the tree was already ancient when he bought the land. Long before there was a neighborhood nearby, long before Silver Ridge community existed, that tree survived storms, droughts, and decades of change. My father taught me how to repair fences beneath its branches. I spent my childhood climbing those thick limbs. When I got older, I built a small wooden bench beside it where I would sit after long days working the ranch. It wasn't just a tree. It was the place where my family memories lived. I walked closer to the stump, running my hand across the rough surface. The cut was fresh. The smell of raw wood filled the air. And that was when I saw the sign. A small orange notice attached to a nearby post. Silver Ridge Community Landscape Improvement Project. I read it twice. Then a third time. Landscape improvement. That was what they called it. The HOA had entered my property and removed something they didn't own. I didn't hear a chainsaw. I didn't see workers. I was hundreds of miles away on vacation while someone decided they had the right to erase a piece of my ranch. My phone buzzed before I could even call anyone. It was Caroline Prescott, the HOA president. "Welcome home, Nathan," she said when I answered. Not "I'm sorry." Not "we made a mistake." Just "welcome home." Like she had been waiting for me to discover it. "Did the tree removal solve the problem?" she asked. I looked at the empty space in front of me. "What problem?" Caroline sighed. That old tree was becoming an eyesore. It affected the appearance of the area. "We finally handled it." Finally handled it. Those words stayed with me. Because to her, the tree was an inconvenience. To me, it was history. "You cut down my tree without permission," I said. She became quiet for a moment. Then she answered with complete confidence. "Nathan, the HOA has authority to protect property values." That sentence told me everything. She didn't think she had done something wrong. She thought she had done me a favor. And standing there beside the empty ground where my family's tree once stood, I realized something. Caroline Prescott didn't understand what she had taken. She didn't know the tree she called ugly had a story. She didn't know it had value. And she definitely didn't know that the mistake she just made would cost her more than she could imagine. People think losing a tree means losing wood, branches, and leaves. They don't understand that sometimes they are destroying something that can never be replaced. The days after I returned home were filled with questions. Not from me, from everyone around me. Neighbors started noticing the empty space on my ranch. People who had driven past my property for years suddenly slowed down when they saw the missing tree. Because that tree was impossible to ignore. It stood higher than the old barn roof. Its branches stretched across the field like giant arms protecting the land beneath it. And then, overnight, it was gone. I spent the next morning walking around the stump, trying to understand how this happened. The more I looked, the worse it felt. The workers hadn't simply removed a tree. They had removed a landmark. There were deep tire marks across the grass. Broken branches scattered around the area. Pieces of bark left behind like evidence of what had happened while I was away. I called the company listed on the landscape notice. The woman who answered sounded nervous the moment I mentioned my address. Mr. Holloway, we were contracted by Silver Ridge Community. Did you receive permission from me? There was a pause. No, sir. We were told the HOA had authorization. That answer confirmed something important. The workers weren't the ones who made the decision. Caroline Prescott did. Later that afternoon, I drove to the Silver Ridge HOA office. The building looked exactly like I expected. Perfect landscaping, fresh paint, everything carefully arranged to create an image of control. Caroline was sitting behind her desk when I walked in. She looked up and smiled. Not because she was happy to see me, because she believed she had already won. Nathan, she said, I assume you saw the improvement. I placed the landscape notice on her desk. Improvement. She leaned back. Yes, that old tree was becoming a problem. I looked at her. A problem. Caroline folded her hands. The branches were uneven. The tree was old. It made the area look neglected. For a moment, I didn't say anything, because I realized something. She wasn't pretending. She truly believed a tree that existed before her neighborhood was somehow an inconvenience. That tree was on my property, I said. Caroline gave a small smile. Nathan, your ranch borders our community. The HOA has a responsibility to protect everyone's property values. There it was again, the same belief. The idea that protecting property values gave her permission to control other people's property. I pulled out my phone and showed her photos of the tree. Pictures from before my vacation. My father standing beside it. My grandfather sitting beneath its branches. The wooden bench I built next to the trunk. For the first time, her expression changed slightly, but only for a second. I understand it had sentimental value, she said. Sentimental value. That phrase bothered me, because she reduced decades of history into two simple words. But I wasn't finished. There is something else you should know, I said. She looked at me. I want every document related to the removal. Her confidence returned. You may request whatever you want, Nathan, but I think you'll find the HOA acted within its rights. I picked up the notice from her desk. That sentence stayed with me, not because it sounded threatening, because it revealed exactly how she thought. Caroline didn't believe rules applied equally. She believed the HOA created the rules, and everyone else followed them. I walked out of that office knowing one thing. The tree was gone, but the story behind it was just beginning. Because Caroline Prescott made the same mistake many powerful people make. She judged the value of something by what she could see, and she had no idea what she had just destroyed. The problem with people who believe they have authority is that they rarely stop to ask one simple question. What happens when someone finally asks for proof? That was the question Caroline Prescott never expected to answer. The morning after our conversation, I started collecting everything. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted the truth. There is a difference. Anger makes people react. Evidence makes people win. I began with the county property records. My ranch had been in my family for decades, and I knew every corner of it. But knowing your land and proving your land are two different things. So I requested every document connected to the property. The original deed, the boundary surveys, the maintenance records, any agreements involving Silver Ridge Community. I expected to find a misunderstanding, a mistake, something that explained why Caroline thought she had permission. Instead, I found something much worse. There was no permission, no easement, no agreement, nothing that gave the HOA control over my property. The tree had been standing there long before Silver Ridge existed, long before Caroline became president, long before anyone decided my ranch needed their approval. I sat at my desk looking through the records while the afternoon sunlight came through the window. The empty space outside bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Every time I looked toward the field, my eyes searched for something that wasn't there anymore. The tree had been part of the landscape for so long that its absence felt unnatural. But then I found something that changed everything. A note attached to an old agricultural record. It mentioned the oak tree, not as a problem, not as an eyesore, as a protected legacy tree recognized by the county's historical landscape program. I read the sentence several times, because suddenly, the value of what Caroline destroyed became much bigger than I imagined. I contacted a certified arborist named Dr. Mason Reed. He came to the ranch the next morning. The first thing he did was walk around the remaining stump in silence. He measured the diameter, examined the growth rings, studied the photographs I had taken before my vacation. Then he looked at me. "Nathan, do you know how old this tree was?" I shook my head. I knew it was old. He looked back at the stump. Over 200 years. Hearing that number out loud felt different. 200 years. That tree existed before roads crossed this land, before houses surrounded the area, before anyone created an HOA and decided they could define what belonged. Dr. Reed explained that the tree's condition and rarity made it extremely valuable, not just emotionally, financially. The estimated replacement and heritage value could reach close to $1 million. I didn't say anything. I just looked outside at the empty field. Because suddenly, Caroline's decision became even more unbelievable. She didn't remove an ugly tree. She destroyed something irreplaceable. That afternoon, I received another email from the HOA. Caroline had written a formal response. She claimed the tree removal was necessary for community standards. She claimed the HOA acted responsibly. She claimed there was no damage. I stared at those words for a long time. No damage. That was the sentence that bothered me most. Because damage wasn't always measured by what someone could see. Sometimes damage was measured by what could never come back. I saved the email, printed it, added it to the growing folder on my desk. The same folder that started with a single landscape notice. Now it contained proof. And for the first time since returning home, I wasn't just trying to understand what happened. I was preparing to show everyone exactly what Caroline Prescott had done. Because she thought she removed a tree. She didn't realize she had created the strongest evidence against herself. The moment someone believes they have the right to take something from you, they usually make one dangerous assumption, that you will never fight back. Caroline Prescott made that assumption about me, and I decided to let her keep believing it. For the next several days, I didn't contact the HOA. I didn't send angry messages. I didn't threaten legal action. I simply watched. Because the more I looked into what happened, the more I realized the tree removal wasn't an isolated decision. It was part of a pattern. I started reviewing old HOA records from Silver Ridge community, meeting notes, landscape proposals, maintenance reports. At first, everything looked normal. Pages of routine discussions about roads, gardens, and neighborhood appearances. Then I found something interesting. Several months before the tree was removed, Caroline had pushed for a new visual improvement initiative. The goal was simple. Make the community look more modern. The problem was that Silver Ridge was built next to private ranch land. Not every piece of land around them belonged to the HOA. But Caroline seemed to forget that. Or maybe she never cared. The more documents I read, the clearer it became. She wasn't maintaining community property. She was expanding the HOA's influence. I contacted my attorney, Marcus Ellison. He was calm, experienced, and the kind of person who never rushed to judgment. After reviewing the documents, he looked at me. "Nathan, the first question isn't how much the tree was worth." I waited. "The first question is whether they had the legal right to touch it." That was the question I had been asking since I came home. And now I finally had an answer. No, they didn't. Marcus explained that property ownership was straightforward. The tree stood on my ranch. The land belonged to me. The HOA had no recorded permission, no maintenance agreement, no legal authority. The only thing they had was confidence. And confidence doesn't replace ownership. But Marcus also pointed out something important. We need to understand why they did it. That question stayed with me. Why would someone risk legal trouble over a tree? Then I found the answer. A landscaping proposal from the HOA board. Attached to the document was a before and after concept image. In the after version, the area where my tree once stood was cleared. The view from the community entrance looked more open, more expensive, more controlled. Caroline wasn't removing a tree because it was ugly. She was removing an obstacle. My ranch had a natural landmark that didn't fit her vision of what the neighborhood should look like. And instead of asking, she decided. That evening, I walked back to the stump. The sun was setting behind the hills. The same hills my grandfather looked at every evening after working the ranch. I placed my hand on the rough wood again. I thought about how many years it took for that tree to grow, and how little time it took for someone to destroy it. That was when I made a decision. I wasn't going to demand an apology. I wasn't going to argue with Caroline. I was going to show her exactly what her decision cost. The next morning, Marcus helped me begin the formal process. We gathered every piece of evidence. The photographs, the property records, the expert evaluation. The HOA documents. Everything. The folder on my desk grew thicker every day. And with every page, the story changed. Caroline believed she had removed a problem. She believed she had improved my property. But she never considered one possibility. The old tree she called worthless had value she could never measure. And now, the person who cut it down was about to discover the real price of her mistake. The biggest mistake people make when they destroy something valuable is believing they are the only ones who know what happened. Caroline Prescott believed the tree was gone. She believed the evidence disappeared with the branches, the leaves, and the wood chips scattered across my ranch. But she forgot something. A tree can be cut down. A story cannot. After we completed the initial review, Marcus and I began preparing the official claim against Silver Ridge Community. The process was slower than anger, but it was stronger. Every detail mattered. We documented the exact location where the tree stood. We compared old property surveys with current records. We collected photographs showing the tree before the removal and the empty space left behind afterward. Nothing was left to opinion, only facts. Then came the most important step, the valuation. Dr. Mason Reed returned to the ranch with a team of specialists. They examined the remaining stump, reviewed historical records, and studied the photographs I had saved over the years. I watched them work quietly around the empty space. It felt strange seeing experts analyze something that no longer existed. The tree itself was gone, but its value was still there. After several hours, Dr. Reed sat with me on the porch. He placed a folder on the table. "Nathan, this was not just an old tree." I opened the report. Inside were pages explaining the tree's age, rarity, historical significance, and replacement value. The final estimate stopped me. Nearly $1 million. For a few seconds, I didn't say anything. Not because of the money, because that number represented what Caroline never understood. The tree wasn't valuable because someone could buy it. It was valuable because no one could recreate it. You cannot purchase 200 years of growth. You cannot replace generations of memories. You cannot plant something today and expect it to become what my family protected for decades. That evening, I received another message from Caroline. She wanted to schedule a meeting. The tone was different this time. Less confident. More careful. I agreed. When I arrived at the HOA office, she was no longer sitting behind her desk like someone who controlled the entire neighborhood. There were documents spread across the table. She looked at me. "Nathan, I think there has been a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. That word again. I almost smiled. Because misunderstandings happen when people make mistakes. But Caroline didn't misunderstand. She made a decision. "You removed my tree without permission," I said. She looked away for a moment. The HOA believed it was within our authority. Believed? I placed the property records on the table. Belief doesn't transfer ownership. The room became quiet. For the first time, Caroline didn't have an immediate response. She looked through the documents. The same kind of documents she assumed nobody would ever check. "You are really going this far over a tree?" she asked. I looked at her. "It stopped being about a tree when you decided my property belonged to someone else." That was the moment the conversation changed. She finally understood. This wasn't about landscaping. It wasn't about appearance. It wasn't about whether she liked the tree. It was about the fact that someone entered my ranch, destroyed my property, and expected me to accept it. Before I left, Caroline tried one final approach. "You know this could become expensive." I picked up the folder containing the evidence. "I know." Then I walked out. Because she was right about one thing. This would become expensive. Just not for me. Over the next few weeks, the HOA received formal notice of the claim. The same organization that once sent me warnings now had to answer questions. Why did they enter private property? Why did they authorize removal without consent? Why? Did they ignore ownership records? And most importantly, why did they destroy something worth nearly $1 million? Caroline thought cutting down the tree ended the problem. Instead, she planted the beginning of her biggest mistake. People often think winning a fight means watching the other side fall apart. They don't realize the most important victories happen before anyone enters a courtroom. By the time Silver Ridge received the official claim, I had already stopped thinking about the tree as something that was taken from me. It became something that would reveal the truth. The HOA expected an angry homeowner. Someone who would complain for a few days and eventually give up. They didn't expect someone who would patiently rebuild the entire timeline of what happened. Marcus and I spent weeks organizing the evidence. Every photograph had a date. Every document had a place. Every statement had a purpose. We created a complete record of the day Caroline Prescott decided she had the authority to remove something that belonged to me. The first major discovery came from the landscaping company. They provided their work order after receiving our legal request. The document showed exactly who approved the removal. Silver Ridge Community Association. Not my name. Not my signature. Not my permission. The second discovery was even more important. The HOA had submitted a request for a community visual improvement project, but the description never mentioned private property. It simply referred to the area as an unused landscape section. Unused. That word bothered me, because Caroline looked at my ranch and saw empty space. She didn't see ownership. She didn't see history. She didn't see the responsibility that came with touching something that wasn't hers. Marcus highlighted that section of the document. This is where they made their mistake, he said. I looked at him. Because they called it unused? Because they believed something they didn't own was theirs to manage. That was the entire problem. The HOA had created its own version of reality. In their world, anything near the community belonged to them. Anything they didn't like could be changed. Anything that affected their image could be removed. But property lines don't care about opinions. They don't care about popularity. They only care about facts. As the case moved forward, Caroline started changing her approach. The confident messages stopped. The warnings became less aggressive. Instead of telling me the HOA had authority, she started saying they acted with good intentions. That was a completely different argument. Because good intentions don't erase responsibility. If someone damages your property while believing they are helping, the damage still exists. One evening, I received an invitation to speak at the HOA board meeting. At first, I thought it was an attempt to negotiate. But when I arrived, I realized something had changed. The room was full. Neighbors who had never asked questions before were sitting in the back. They wanted answers. Not from me. From Caroline. A few residents admitted they had never been told the tree was on private land. Others said they assumed the HOA had permission. And that was the moment the atmosphere shifted. Because Caroline's biggest advantage was never the rules. It was that people trusted her explanation. Now they were hearing the other side. I stood there holding the same folder I had carried since the day I returned from vacation. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to attack anyone. I simply explained what happened. A tree stood on my property. The HOA removed it without permission. Experts valued what was destroyed. The documents proved it. When I finished speaking, the room was silent. Caroline looked around. For the first time, she wasn't controlling the conversation. She wasn't the person giving everyone instructions. She was the person being asked for answers. And as I walked out of that meeting, I knew something important. The battle was no longer about one tree. It was about whether someone could use power as a replacement for permission. Caroline thought she removed an old tree, but she actually removed the one thing protecting her story, the assumption that nobody would question her. The moment someone stops defending their decision and starts defending their reputation, the truth has finally reached them. That was exactly what happened to Caroline Prescott. After the HOA meeting, everything changed. For weeks, Caroline had controlled the story. She told residents the tree was old. She told them it was unsafe. She told them the removal was necessary for the community. But once the documents appeared, the story became impossible to control. People started asking different questions. Not, why was the tree removed? But who gave permission? That was the question Caroline couldn't answer. The HOA board scheduled another meeting, this time with legal representatives present. I knew it would be different before I even walked through the door. The last meeting felt like a presentation. This one felt like an investigation. The room was filled with homeowners. Some were angry. Some were confused. Some simply wanted to know why they had never been told the full truth. Caroline sat at the front table with her attorney. She looked composed, but I noticed something. She wasn't looking at the audience anymore. She was looking at the documents in front of her. The same documents she once believed didn't matter. The HOA attorney began by explaining that the organization acted in good faith. Good faith. Another phrase people use when they want mistakes to sound acceptable. Marcus waited patiently. Then it was our turn. He didn't start with the value of the tree. He started with ownership. The property where the tree stood belongs exclusively to Nathan Holloway, he said. The room became quiet. Then he presented the records, the deed, the survey, the lack of authorization, the contractor agreement. Piece by piece, the timeline became clear. The HOA didn't maintain the tree. They removed it. They didn't repair a shared area. They entered private property. They didn't protect the community. They made a decision that affected someone else's land. Then Marcus presented the arborist report. The room changed when the number appeared. Nearly $1 million. People looked at Caroline, not because of the money, because they finally understood the scale of the mistake. The tree she called ugly wasn't an ordinary piece of landscaping. It was a rare, historical tree with decades of value attached to it. One resident near the back of the room raised his hand. "I've lived here 15 years, he said. "I was told that land was part of the community." Marcus looked toward him. "And who provided that information?" The room went silent. Nobody answered, because everyone already knew. Caroline had built the assumption, and the assumption became the foundation of the problem. After the meeting, I received several messages from neighbors. Some apologized. Others shared stories about previous HOA decisions they questioned but never challenged. That was when I realized something. The tree wasn't the only thing Caroline had damaged. She had damaged trust. The following week, the HOA attorney contacted Marcus. Their position had changed. The aggressive tone disappeared. The threats disappeared. They wanted to discuss a settlement. But there was one thing I needed first. Accountability. I wanted the record to show what happened. Not because I wanted revenge. Because if nobody challenged the decision, someone else would become the next person standing beside an empty space where something important used to be. Caroline thought the tree was just an object. She thought removing it would solve a problem. Instead, she created a question that everyone in Silver Ridge now wanted answered. Who gave the HOA the right to take what was never theirs? And for the first time since I came home from vacation, Caroline Prescott didn't have control of the answer. The most satisfying moment in any fight is not when your opponent loses. It is when they finally realize they were wrong from the beginning. That moment came when Silver Ridge finally admitted what happened. The settlement discussions began quietly. No public announcements. No dramatic statements. Just emails, meetings, and lawyers carefully choosing every word. But the tone had changed. A few weeks earlier, Caroline Prescott was telling me the HOA had authority. Now, the HOA was asking how to resolve the consequences of using that authority incorrectly. Marcus handled most of the conversations. He explained that we were not interested in a quick apology that disappeared. After everyone moved on, the damage was real. The tree was gone forever. The property had been altered without permission, and the community needed to understand why it happened. During the negotiations, something unexpected happened. Several homeowners from Silver Ridge contacted me directly. They told me they had never known the full story. They thought the tree removal was part of approved community maintenance. They thought the HOA had followed the proper process. But when they saw the documents, they realized the truth. Caroline had made the decision. Not the entire community. Not the homeowners. Her. That was the part that changed everything. Because an HOA is supposed to represent the people who live there. It is not supposed to become one person's personal authority. The final legal review confirmed what we already knew. The HOA had no right to remove the tree. They had no ownership interest in my land. They had no permission to enter my property and destroy something that belonged to me. And the value assessment remained clear. Nearly $1 million. The number that started as a surprise became the number everyone remembered. Not because money was the most important part, but because it showed the size of Caroline's mistake. She looked at a tree and saw something inconvenient. The experts looked at it and saw history. My family looked at it and saw memories. The law looked at it and saw property. Caroline had only seen what she wanted to see. The final agreement required the HOA to compensate me for the damage and cover the costs connected to the unauthorized removal. But there was another consequence Caroline never expected. The homeowners requested a leadership review. People who had ignored questionable decisions in the past started asking more questions. They wanted transparency. They wanted accountability. And eventually, Caroline resigned as HOA president. Not because I forced her to. Because the community no longer trusted her judgment. A few months later, I stood on my ranch looking at the empty space where the old tree once stood. The area was still different. No settlement could bring back 200 years of growth. No amount of money could recreate the shade, the branches, or the memories underneath them. But something had changed. The empty space no longer represented what was taken. It represented what was protected. I decided to keep a large section of the original wood. I had it preserved and placed near the old bench where my father and grandfather used to sit. A reminder not of the person who cut it down, but of why it mattered. Caroline thought she was removing an ugly old tree. She thought she was improving my ranch. She never understood that she wasn't dealing with a piece of landscaping. She was dealing with a legacy. And in the end, the biggest mistake wasn't cutting down the tree. The biggest mistake was believing nobody would care enough to fight for it. The strange thing about justice is that it doesn't always bring back what was lost. Sometimes, it simply makes sure nobody can take something precious from someone else again. Months after the tree was removed, I stood in the same field where it once stood. The ranch looked different. The open space was still there. The sunlight still crossed the grass the same way. The wind still moved through the property like it had for generations. But something was missing. A 200-year story had ended in a single afternoon, and no court decision could change that. That was the part Caroline Prescott never understood. Winning was never about getting the tree back. The tree was gone. The branches were gone. The shade that covered my family for decades was gone. What mattered was proving that nobody had the right to erase something they didn't own. The final agreement with Silver Ridge Community was completed after months of review. The HOA accepted responsibility for the unauthorized removal. They paid the compensation required for the damage. They covered the costs connected to the legal process. But the biggest change wasn't financial. It was the way people looked at the HOA. For years, many residents assumed the organization always knew best. They believed every decision was carefully considered. They believed the rules were being applied fairly. But the tree changed that. Because the tree showed everyone what happens when authority is left unchecked. A few weeks after everything was settled, I attended one final HOA meeting. Not because I wanted to celebrate. Not because I wanted to see Caroline embarrassed. I went because I wanted people to remember what happened. The room was different from the first meeting I attended. There was less fear, more questions, more honesty. Residents discussed new rules requiring transparency before any action involving private property. They wanted written approval, clear documentation, accountability, things that should have existed from the beginning. Caroline was no longer sitting at the front of the room. Her position was empty. Her name was no longer on the announcements. The person who once believed she could make decisions without permission had become the reason everyone demanded more responsibility. After the meeting, I drove back to my ranch. I stopped beside the old wooden bench near where the tree once stood. The preserved section of the original trunk rested there. A reminder of what happened, but also a reminder of what mattered. I placed my hand against the wood and thought about my grandfather. He always told me land wasn't just something you owned. It was something you protected. At the time, I thought he was talking about fences and boundaries. Now I understood. Protecting land meant protecting the stories attached to it. The memories. The history. The things that cannot be replaced once they are gone. Caroline saw an old tree that didn't match her idea of beauty. She saw a problem that needed to be removed. I saw the place where my father taught me about responsibility. I saw the shade where my family gathered. I saw a piece of history standing quietly on my ranch. And the law saw what Caroline refused to see. Ownership matters. Permission matters. Truth matters. She thought she was removing something worthless. Instead, she revealed the true value of patience, evidence, and standing up when something is wrong. The tree never came back, but the lesson remained. Because sometimes justice isn't about restoring what was destroyed. Sometimes justice is making sure everyone understands why it should have never been destroyed in the first place.